I think the time has come when the American people realize that we're in this together and that we sink or swim together. And I say to you, maybe, just maybe, that that's the way it should be. A test of our courage, of our compassion.
Believe it or not, there was a time when Americans trusted their politicians. But in the mid-20th century, the trust between the American people and their government quickly started to dissipate. First came the paranoia of the Cold War, which seeped down from the top. Accusations of communist conspiracy ran rampant, and McCarthyism was the order of the day.
Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
Trust in governmental institutions completely collapsed during the Vietnam War, with Lyndon Johnson's famous credibility gap.
It is true that a house divided against itself by the spirit of faction, of party, of region, of religion, of race, is a house that cannot stand.
When Johnson decided not to run again in 1968, another McCarthy, Senator Eugene McCarthy, entered the race to take on Vice President Hubert Humphrey on the Vietnam War.
Well, there are two or three things wrong with it, I think. First place, the Pied Piper didn't lead the children over the riverbank. He led the rats over it.
Eugene McCarthy was soon joined by Bobby Kennedy, who unfortunately would not make it through the 1968 primaries.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible?
Eugene McCarthy's speechwriter was a journalist named Jeremy Larner. Even after Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination in the most chaotic convention in American history, Jeremy Larner continued to work for the peace movement to end the Vietnam War. Larner even wrote a speech for Paul Newman to give at the moratorium, the largest protest in American history. The credibility gap continued to widen under Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War, which Nixon had pretended to have a secret plan to end, waged on, the feeling only grew deeper that politics was a dirty business and politicians were crooks. Everyone was out for themselves. In this whirlwind of distrust and quickly eroding credibility, Robert Redford and the director Michael Ritchie approached Jeremy Larner in 1971 to write a screenplay that they had an idea for. Michael Ritchie, who would go on to direct The Bad News Bears, had worked for a California senator named John Tunney, who took on George Murphy, the first movie actor to hold political office. John Tunney was the basis for Robert Redford's Bill McKay, a liberal activist who was approached to run for the Senate on the promise that he can say whatever he wants.
You're saying I can say what I want, do what I want, go where I please.
It's right. Here's your guarantee.
I lose.
Bill McKay's good looks, he is Robert Redford after all, and incredibly earnest outbursts help him win the Democratic primary to face off against the Nixonian law and order type Republican Crocker Jarman.
I remember my mom and dad went through the 1930s without welfare, without poverty programs. Why, none of us kids even had a social worker. How did we do it? Well, ladies, excuse me, but we worked our butts off.
Peter Boyle plays Marvin Lucas, a cynical and skilled campaign manager who comes up with the idea of running McKay, a virtual political outsider. Although originally considered an unwinnable race, Bill McKay begins to actually close the gap between himself and Crocker Jarman. This development leads the cynical Marvin Lucas to start pushing McKay towards the center.
The reason you're vulnerable on this stuff is you haven't established yourself on crime, right?
You're gonna have to get out of here.
In a second, officer.
This is Bill McKay. Care if it's Henry Fonda.
Well, give me the damn program for it. This is your crime program. You have to get this in your lunch speech today, and you have to get it in the debate tomorrow night. Whatever questions they ask, just give them our answers.
Crime isn't an issue, it's a symptom.
The once earnest pronouncements turn into bland platitudes.
Well, we can't let a school bus carry all the burdens of our society. The main problem is still, how do we get a first-rate education for each and every child? We can't afford to have inferior schools anywhere, and we should always try to preserve the concept of the neighborhood school in achieving this.
Coming full circle, Ritchie and Robert Redford got Hubert Humphrey to make a cameo. The candidate is a prescient warning about how American politics turns idealistic young liberals into jaded centrists. It could not have come at a better time, as the post-Nixonian wave of young Watergate babies would ride into power just 2 years later.
You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.